ABC Listen. Podcasts, radio, news, music and more.
When Donald Trump won the 2016 election, the world was shocked because polls had predicted an easy win for Democratic nominee Hillary Clinton. They were wrong. So what do the polls show this time, and can we trust them? Today, Matt Taglia, Senior Director at Emerson College Polling, explains the science behind the polls. I'm Sam Hawley on Gadigal land in Sydney. This is ABC News Daily. Matt, it's just over 3 weeks until the US election, which is a little hard to believe. Time flies, doesn't it? But we're going to have a look with you at where the polling stands and get a sense of how accurate, I suppose, the polls are at this point. So let's look first at the national vote. Tell me, who's winning? Is it Donald Trump or Kamala Harris?
Well, right now, in our latest polling, we show that Harris is ahead in the national vote by about 2 points. Now, of course, that comes with a margin of error, but I think that it's reasonable at this point to expect that, and we see this in polls across the country, that Harris is probably up in that popular vote by 2 to 3 points or so. I think her margin could be a little bit lower than Joe Biden's in 2020. And that's mostly due to some of the bluer states, as we'd say here, so the more Democratic-leaning states like New York, where Republicans are doing a little bit better on some of the ballot tests. So her margin might be a little bit lower than Joe Biden in 2020.
Okay, so that's the national vote. But what about, Matt, the swing states? Because they determine the winner in the end, don't they?
They do. And unlike the national vote to some degree, the swing states are really as close as they can get. Since Biden has left the ticket and Harris has been the presidential nominee for the Democrats, these states have been exceptionally close. We've seen very little to change in the past several weeks. We did see a bump after the debate, but that seems to have faded slightly for Harris. Harris and Trump either could win really any of these states, and I think the polling from other firms as well confirms that.
So too tight to call in those swing states by the sound of it.
Yeah. What's been interesting in this election cycle, again, this is since Harris has been the Democratic nominee, is that polling has been pretty consistent. Very rarely do we see a poll where one candidate is ahead of the other and it's outside of that poll's margin of error. We haven't really seen either candidate have a lead of more than 4 points in any of these swing states. The polling has been very consistent, and I think that that's kind of unique this cycle. Normally, we would expect to see, some results that have contradictory conclusions. There are some outlier polls for sure, and I think that on election day we might see some outlier results. That usually happens, but if I had to put money on the race, I wouldn't know where to put it right now.
All right. Okay. So, Matt, now let's have a look at the polling methodology and how over time it has changed. I think we all remember the polls were mostly wrong in 2016. We were told, of course, that Hillary Clinton would win, and we were rather shocked, I think, when Donald Trump became the president. So just remind me first, what went wrong with the polling then?
Well, in 2016, and the story is a little bit more complicated than the polls were wrong. In some cases, the polls didn't exist. So in some of these states, like Wisconsin and in Michigan, there were very few polls at the statewide level. And that was for a few different reasons. One, most believed that Hillary Clinton would win those states fairly easily. And two, polling is expensive. Just those two states alone, which were crucial to Donald Trump winning the election, the fact that we had a major blind spot there that was enough alone to change the narrative. So where there was state polling, it was usually okay. But 2016 was also a very different time for polling. In some ways, it was still sort of the Stone Age, so to speak. Most firms were still relying on live callers and what we call random digit dialing. Basically, the phone operator is given a random list of numbers, within a specific area code, as we call them, and they'll dial that until they find a registered voter who meets the qualifications to take the survey. So it's highly inefficient. So in that respect, polling has changed a lot. We've seen the rise of online polls, of using text messages, other means of trying to reach these voters, and I think we're going to see more changes going forward.
Okay, so polling has changed significantly since 2016 to make it more reliable. So for the Emerson College Polling, tell me who you speak to and how you find them.
Sure, yeah. We reach out to a list of registered voters, which is usually a randomly selected list. So, let's say we're polling the state of Virginia. We get these files of registered voters through a third party, and we randomly select a certain number of voters, and we make telephone calls to landline phones, and then we send text messages to mobile phones. We are now also using online opt-in panels, and that is namely to reach those harder to reach folks. So young people and ethnic minorities especially. Our goal is to meet people where they are.
How do you make sure then, Matt, that the group is representative of the entire area or state or of the rest of the country?
Yeah, good question. Well, a couple different ways. So inevitably, we will have to do what's called weighting. And that involves assigning a number to each respondent that will ultimately determine how much their responses count in the final data. And that is proportional to whatever the population is. So that is all meant to look like what the population will look like on election day.
Weighting is really super interesting because I've been reading about how some pollsters weigh or change their results to make sure they don't underestimate Donald Trump votes. Just tell me about that.
Yeah, so one way that some have tried to correct for that so-called shy Trump voter effect, where some believed that Trump voters were being underrepresented in samples, and in some cases that they were actually unwilling to tell interviewers that they were going to vote for Trump. So the way that we mitigate that latter is by not using interviewers. So we don't have live interviewers in all our calling. And so we think it's reasonable to suspect that people are being truthful whenever they respond to our polls. And something that's been introduced is asking folks who they supported in 2020 and then weighting back to those results. So in other words, taking the poll and making it look more like 2020 to correct the underlying demographics. Let's say you have X number of college-educated white voters in your data. There's so much you can do with weights to correct for that. But ultimately, there are some underlying trends there that you may not pick up on. And so making that data look more like 2020 for those who voted in 2020, that is seen as a way to mitigate that sort of invisible Trump effect.
And Matt, we talk a lot as well, of course, about the margin of error. Can we just explain that for people that don't understand it? It depends on the sample size, doesn't it?
It does, and it's more or less a fixed number depending on the sample size. So for 1,000, it's around 3%. So if we release a poll that is 1,000 registered voters, and that poll has about a 3% margin of error, then that means if Harris is at 50% and Trump is at 50%, the margin of error says that it could actually be Harris at 53% and Trump at 47%. Or it could be Harris at 47%, Trump at 53%. You have to keep that in mind when you look at the results of these polls. But when you see trend lines, I think that that's probably the most useful way to look at polls, how things are changing over time. You can be reasonably sure that, a 3-point lead for one candidate over the course of 3 months, that probably means that they have a lead.
All right, well, Matt, let's look then at what's to come with such a short time until Election Day.
Yeah.
Do you get a sense at all from your polling about what are the issues that could sway people one way or the other, particularly in those really key swing states?
Yes. The economy is the top issue across the country. And immigration in particular, that is the number 2 issue. And in some of the swing states like Arizona, that's the top issue. I don't know how much it could change at this point.
Right, yes.
So absent some major event, I don't know that folks are going to be all that swayed on the issues. I don't know that the candidates, absent a major event or maybe another debate, which I think is highly unlikely at this point, absent something like that, I don't know that, the issues are really going to change folks' minds.
And even an assassination attempt didn't seem to actually make... That was a pretty major event, and it didn't seem to make much difference to the polls, right?
Yeah, 2 attempts.
2 attempts, exactly.
Yeah.
Okay, so Matt, just tell me, how do you feel now about the accuracy of polls these days? Do you think the industry, once it's all done and dusted, is going to be able to hold its head high and say, look, we told you this was going to happen and it did?
Yeah, I do feel good about the industry overall. I don't see many surprises. That's also to say that we're not able to necessarily predict who's going to win this thing. Right. The polls have sort of converged on the fact that this is a close race and that there's no single swing state that seems to be a given for either candidate.
And I gather your prediction is, as your polls show, too close to call.
Too close to call.
Unless you want to go out on a limb.
Not yet. Maybe in a week.
Oh, perfect. Matt Taglia is a senior director at Emerson College Polling, a non-partisan organisation. This episode was produced by Sydney Peed and Cara Jensen-McKinnon. Audio production by Sam Dunn. Our supervising producer is David Cody. I'm Sam Hawley. ABC News Daily will be back again on Monday. Thanks for listening.
2 years ago, someone handed me a secret recording.
You are the bloke that they're going to lock up. Let me tell you that right now.
This is Mr. Big. He's a crime boss, a kingpin.
Got coppers in every state that I pay good money to.
And on this tape, he promises to help keep his henchmen out of jail.
I'm willing to go out on a limb and fix these problems, okay?
But first, he wants the truth about a murder.
If I can fix this, you're on.
There are lots of people that don't want me asking questions about Mr. Big, but I think everyone has a right to know who he really is. Mr. Big is an explosive new season of the ABC's true crime podcast, Unravel. Search for Unravel on the ABC Listen app.